Sure, no problem.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Agree or Disagree the podcast. It is I, Kevin Olenek. It is, of course, a controversial podcast that pushes you to think differently and connects you with your community. You can add me as a friend on Facebook, Kevin Olenek, or like Agree or Disagree the podcast on Facebook. Follow me on Twitter at KEVOLE, Spreaker, KEVOLE, SoundCloud, KEVOLE. You can also subscribe on YouTube, and Kevin Olenek, and subscribe on iTunes, Agree or Disagree the podcast. I'd like to take you back to February 13th, 1988. It was a cloudy and cold day, I remember it, but the electricity and excitement in the air warmed it up. Whether it was at home, with friends or family watching on TV, or at McMahon Stadium, Calgary watched the 1988 Winter Olympics with the rest of the world. The next 15 days, Calgary watched and opened their cities to tourists all across the world. A then record 57 nations and 1,423 athletes competed. You may remember the names Eddie the Eagle. You may remember the Jamaican Bobsled team, which films have been made about them. Now in February of 2026, it may also be cloudy and cold. It may also be sunny and warm, and a Chinook again. It also may be the same within an hour, knowing Calgary. But could the Winter Olympics return to Calgary in 2026? On Tuesday, after a marathon session, Calgary City Council voted 12-3 to move forward with its 2026 Olympics bid process and hold a plebiscite for the public in Calgary on November the 13th. Now the bid does include a new field house, a new mid-size arena seating up to 6,000 people, using existing facilities from the 1988 Winter Games in Calgary and Canmore, as well as using Whistler from the 2010 Winter Olympic Games. The total cost will be approximately $5.2 billion, which has caused some controversy in Calgary. To help hopefully clear up some misconceptions and dig into this a little bit more, we have one of the organizer from Yes Calgary 2026, or not the organizer, Jason Ribeiro from Yes Calgary 2026, to help us join us today on Agree or Disagree the podcast. How are you today?
Great, Kevin. How are you?
Great. No snow here in Kamloops yet, but word on the social media is it is coming to Calgary or there soon. So
don't say it. Don't say
I'm
it.
not saying it.
Think about it.
Okay, I did the no snow mantra. So let's start with why. Why do you feel the Winter Olympics would be a benefit for Calgary? Like, from maybe your own personal perspective, what was the process of getting this Olympic bid together?
So I'll back up a bit. From my personal perspective, the Olympics aren't leading the conversation that we're having in the community. This is an extension of a conversation that myself, a number of community advocates, a number of entrepreneurs, a number of nonprofit leaders from all sides of the spectrum. This is an extension of a conversation we've been having about city building for a number of years. So my interest particularly in advocating for public policies that work for ordinary folks, that take care of our most vulnerable, really dovetails into a number of different lanes. And what's interesting about Yes Calgary 2026 is it started from that conversation that we'd already been having. And when we talk about the why in relation to the Olympics, it starts from that foundation of understanding what kind of city we are. We're a city that has shown incredible resilience, I think, over the past few years in relation to the efforts tied in with the flood, in relation to the economic downturn, but also in understanding that at the same time, we are the most livable city in North America, according to The Economist, the fourth most livable city in the entire world. So in understanding the tensions between what's really positive and understanding the tensions between what we can improve upon as a city, that is what led us to a conversation about the Olympic bid. And what I noticed and what my colleagues and I noticed in the community was that a lot of the conversation about the Olympics was premised in very technical updates coming from council chambers that were being filtered through the media. And we didn't have an arm that was at the grassroots level talking about a vision for the city and how a potential Olympic bid would dovetail. So now I'll get to the why. The why behind the Olympic bid for me personally is because it could potentially contribute to building out our already stated goals to make us an even better city. It is not about an overall transformation. It is not about unrelenting cheerleading or boosterism. It is really about a stock taking of where are we as a city right now? And where could we be in another 8 years, in another 30 years, and another 50 years? And how does an Olympic bid contribute to that conversation? And in starting to think about our long-term priorities that have gone unfunded, in thinking about making a substantive contribution to recreation and sport, and to thinking about at a time where foreign investment into Canada has declined, yet we know that we have all of this amazing work happening in Calgary, what would we do with a 6 to 8 year ramp up towards an Olympic and Paralympic Games with the eyes of the world upon us? These are the conversations that led to Yes, Calgary 2026. So the why is very much rooted in the essence of who Calgary is. It's a dynamic, it's a resilient city that has operated from a number of tensions and is looking to define the next 30 years. We have benefited, I would argue, and a lot of people would argue, from the 88 games. Now it's just reframing that conversation of how do we want to benefit for the next 30 years, and does the Olympics dovetail with that? I believe it does. And I think that's a very organic conversation to be having rather than coming in up front and saying, I love the Olympics, let's pursue it. I don't think that's the way we've approached it. And I'm going to fight tooth and nail until November 14th, until if we're successful and go forward with a bid, to make sure that that Calgary first approach is the one that we're taking.
Yeah, that's fair. So for your perspective, this isn't, and I'm not hearing a lot of this perception, but this isn't a nostalgic thing to bring back the memories of 1988.
Well, let's be clear. I moved here in 2015. Recent polling showed that I think, maybe 10 to 15%, if that, of people who were here in 1988 are still here today in 2018. So we've had a huge demographic shift. So when folks say we already hosted or we've already done this, I sometimes, very thoughtfully put back the question to them, well, who is we? Who is this we that hosted the games and has already done this and has already experienced it? We had a number of folks that had an amazing time, not only during the games and the ramp up to the games, but afterwards for 30 years that enjoyed that legacy. But as our population continues to grow, as we have more newcomers coming into our city, as we have people coming from across the country to engage in the entrepreneurial spirit and the resiliency and the dynamic nature of this city, those are new ideas, that is new human capital, that is new perspectives. And I think in combination and as a collective, we should be able to define a new vision while using the best of 1988 and understanding that it did have a profound positive impact on our community, while respecting that legacy, defining a very new vision for what the economic climate is today, for what the IOC's current mandate is under Agenda 2020, and in understanding what has gone right and what has gone wrong in past bids and in past hosting, and really put forward a bid that respects all of those different tensions, concerns, and strengths, and define a new vision for the next 30 years. So I'm not so much caught up in the nostalgia. The only nostalgic element that really speaks to me is the efforts of the Frank Kings, the Bob Nivens, the commensurate history around folks that went out into the community and sold pins door to door that had a vision for what the Olympics would mean for Calgary. I think that spirit behind the efforts that we're undertaking, I see that spirit in Calgary 2026, and Mary Moran, the first woman to lead a Canadian Olympic bid, and Scott Hutchinson and their team. I see that effort to respond to steep opposition with an unrelenting spirit to make impact for the community and for generations to come. So that is the nostalgia and the legacy that I think keeps us going and makes sure that we're trending in the right direction. But it's less about the kind of spirit and the emotion that I don't think resonates with a number of folks who potentially were not here during the games.
That's fair. Now let's get into the bid part. And maybe for those who don't know, which would include me, how did you come up with this bid? Like, what was the strategy behind it? Did you, where was the consultation? Tell us a little bit about where you got to this point where you presented this to City Council earlier this week.
Well, I'll make an upfront clarification because there seems to be some confusion within the community. So Calgary2026 is the bid corporation. That organization expanded out of the work that the Calgary Bid Exploration Committee, or CBEC, as they were called, did initially last year. So they're a formal bid corporation. My arm of this, or my organization that I'm proud to be a part of, is a citizens volunteer group as Yes Calgary 2026. So we had nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with creating the bid. That was the work that the bid corporation themselves did, and that is the work that they presented to council. I had no idea what they were going to present. What we did a week before, about a week and a half before, I think, Bid Corporation Calgary 2026 presented to council, what our team did was look at the Calgary Bid Exploration Committee's work, CBEC's work, looked at the 2010 post-analysis of the Vancouver Games, looked at our long-term capital priorities at the City of Calgary, and looked at media reports to see where the political leadership in the city was going to take the city in the next budget cycle. And we created the terms for what a good deal would be. So we outlined a bid that actually had the bid book cost coming in at $5.8 billion, split between, obviously, operations and capital. The operations side would balance, and then the capital would be an investment across the province and across the country. The bid corporation presented to council, if ours was a good deal, theirs was a great deal, because they came in at $5.23 billion, again with operations balancing, and then the rest of public sector contribution into infrastructure. So I just want to make that separation clear between what our effort does and what the formal bid corporation Calgary 2026 does.
Sure. Thank you for doing that. But so maybe explain what the decisions were and why, from your perspective, this bid works. Sure.
So we'll back up a bit to talk about where the Olympics are in relation to host cities right now. So for the past, let's say 3 or 4, particularly in the Winter Games, we've seen a lot of cities, particularly those in Eastern European and Asian countries, which don't have a lot of infrastructure related to winter sport. And even in the Summer Games with Rio, for example, you've seen a lot of developing countries, not developed nations, take on the Olympics as a way to garner support for building out their city completely where a city doesn't even exist. So you're having arenas being built without the infrastructure or sports environment for people to actually use the facilities after the games. You had, in the Sochi example, huge issues of political corruption, corruption in the construction industry. And you had a lot of these cities and countries hosting, which in my opinion should have been in no position to host in relation to the IOC. And the IOC themselves has had their own issues. So I think what they noticed, and I think what a lot of people have noticed, is that this model no longer works. Even the conduct around the bid procedure no longer works. So what the IOC did was they launched a very ambitious governance reform within the International Olympic Committee called Agenda 2020. and it is very, very comprehensive. And me, as a little bit of a skeptic, wanted to ensure that not only are they saying the right things, but are they doing the right things? And in the ramp up to this bid, I became increasingly confident that not only were they saying and talking the talk, but they were walking the walk as well. And I'm the first one to call someone out when they don't fulfill their end of the bargain, but also to give someone credit when they actually keep their word. They said that they would post the host contract in advance. They did so, and it was the exact same. They said that they would be making it more financially viable for cities to host, and they offered up $1.2 billion in Canadian money for the host city in 2026 to share in some of the broadcast revenues. About $700 million of that would be cash and the rest in-kind services. They've reduced $500 million or produced $500 million in savings from the candidature process that didn't exist before. So this is what was setting up the terms for a bid even before the bid corporation did their work. And so in looking at our long-term priorities and looking what we presented in advance of the bid corporation and then being in council chambers on Tuesday and seeing what they presented, I saw a very logical next step to what the IOC started, to what Calgary's priorities are. And essentially, it's under the premise that we have an amazing legacy from 1988. This is an example test case that should be used around the world. And frankly, if you talk to folks in the international sports community, if you talk to people in urban planning, this is one of the crown jewels of planning of infrastructure related to hosting major events, because a large majority of these facilities are operational. Yes, they need upgrades, potentially for competing for high-level athletes and in major stakes international events, but they have stood the test of time and we have reaped the benefit. So what they did in the bid corporation hosting plans on Tuesday was release a plan that I think was quite conservative, that held about $1 billion in contingency so that we have a little bit of flexibility in terms of the cost estimates, which reused all of our existing facilities, which is what the IOC wanted in terms of a 2026 host as part of their Agenda 2020 reforms. They forwarded a bid that talked about meaningfully engaging our Indigenous brothers and sisters in the spirit of truth and reconciliation as equal partners. They actually forwarded a very interesting story and narrative that went along with the bid, and were quite conservative, I think, in the cost. And once they were able to, I think, tell council directly, especially to the councillors who tried to misinform the public about the price tag, when separating operations from capital costs, they outlined a bid which would allow us to achieve our already established city goals for less money than it would take to achieve them separate from a bid. And that is the fundamental thesis behind why I support this bid, which is we are going to need a field house built anyways, and the mayor and council have signaled that this is the number one unfunded priority, that it's probably going to be talked about in the next budget cycle, which is in late November as well. That has a $300 million price tag. We have a number of Olympic facilities that need to be upgraded regardless, like McMahon Stadium, like a number of these Olympic facilities. And we also need affordable housing. We have 4,000 people on the list for social housing that is yet to be built. So for the price tag of less than achieving all of those things which we already need, we're able to forward a bid that leverages more provincial dollars, more federal dollars, and more private sector support, which offsets the cost of operations. I think that this is a great deal. It's a novel deal. It's a creative deal for Calgary, and I'm glad that they didn't shine a lot of sexy items in the faces of Calgarians, because this is what matters, I think, for building our city forward.
Okay, so within that, you talked about the field house, you talked about McMahon Stadium, and you talked about a new arena. What was the reason behind not presenting a new over 10,000 seat arena and potentially a new stadium? What was the reason for that not being in the bid?
Well, I don't want to speak for them in terms of their rationale. I can speak to, from an outsider perspective, the pragmatics. The arena is a very contentious project right now. It is a major undertaking that has a history of negotiations that are completely separate from the bid. So I think that the bid corporation, Calgary 2026, was quite smart in stating very much up front to council that those ongoing negotiations, those private owners, the city of Calgary, they should continue their negotiations separate from this. It is not the job of the bid corporation to step in as an unelected body to negotiate on behalf of the city. They were charged with doing one thing, which was, given the information that Calgary Bid Exploration Committee did, and given some direction from council in terms of what their existing priorities are that were unfunded, can you create a very competitive bid that is in the best social and economic interest of Calgarians? I think that that's what they've done. Their job is not to negotiate. So they've built in enough flexibility that if a deal is reached between the Flames ownership and the city, I think that the hosting plan, which is a plan, can augment and shift and allow for that affordance. But as for right now, we have a corral stadium that's no longer used, that would potentially be used for the games and also after. And we also need a field house. The important thing to also mention as part of this is that as our population grows, you mentioned 88 when we had about 600,000 people here. As our population has surged over 1 million people and will continue to grow, based on the planning that folks did in the 1970s in relation to recreation and sport, they didn't plan them very thoughtfully. And over the years, the city has been stitching these facilities together to make sure that they're operational so that folks can take their kids on the weekend, that folks can work out in places and be healthy and active. But what's happened is that our population has grown so fast that we are going to lack at a certain point 2 whole recreation facilities to be able to serve the basic needs of our population. So when I look at these arenas and I look at these sports facilities being included, and they're on the smaller end for right now, and this is our bid, I think that that's quite smart given the fact that we need to make a commitment to sport and recreation as our population is trending younger, which it is, and as we are lacking a lot of sports and recreation facilities, to not only invite smaller artists and smaller performers to those venues, but also to use them for the semi-pro or amateur sporting needs of our community. So I think that's the smart thing to do for right now. I think that the negotiations in relation to the arena should not factor into this, despite the fact that people want a kind of whole package of one. I think it's in the best interest of taxpayers and public benefit to keep them separate for now.
Yeah. Okay. I see that. I think that there was a thought out there for many people that the Olympic bid would include strategically a new arena, and then we would be able to wipe our hands with that new arena for the Flames conversation, and that would be done. But that sounds, it's what I'm hearing you say that that's sort of a separate thing at this point in time.
Well, we'll look at what, if we go back to the municipal election of 2017, look at what, polling and Calgarians actually responded when the Flames proposal got released and the city's proposal got released. There was a huge backlash to what the Flames were proposing as opposed to what the city offer was, which was a third of public dollars, a third in a ticket surcharge, which would go to as a user fee, and a third to the ownership of the Flames. Folks overwhelmingly thought that was a fair deal, which signals to me and signals to many others that if public dollars are going to be contributed to a private arena, a privately owned arena, it has to be in the need of public benefit. And there were a lot of folks even as well that thought that the city's offer was too generous at a third, and a third. So to ensure that I think the bid corporation is respecting Calgary taxpayers, as much as we all want a new arena for the Flames, and let's be clear, we all do, to be able to respect Calgary taxpayer dollars and not just envelop a large sum of public contributions into that fold, especially when Calgary taxpayers said, I don't want to subsidize a private arena beyond what I think is reasonable. I think that to keep them separate and to make sure that those negotiations are ongoing, to make sure that there's enough room that if they reach a deal separately, we can include it as part of the Olympic Games and maybe augment the existing plan, I think is the smart thing to do, rather than to say, Calgary taxpayers, we want to get this done. So because the numbers in an Olympic bid are usually quite big up front, we'll just envelop a few $100 million into that equation, or $100 million into that equation, or whatever the number would be. I think that that's the wrong way to go about it. Let them do their work. Let them continue. Be flexible enough to include it, but respect the taxpayer contributions, respect citizens, and make sure that public dollars have public benefit. And I think that's the very central theme to what the bid book that was released on Tuesday is, that the public dollars that are going to be contributed to this bid book, which hopefully I think is going to end around $495 to $500 million to the city taxpayer, is going to yield overwhelming public benefit, and more so than if we pursued those benefits outside of an Olympic bid. The $500 million, if it's only shouldered to Calgary taxpayers, probably gets you a field house, probably gets you some level of upgrades. As part of an Olympic bid, it gets you the field house, it gets you the upgrades to our facilities, including our Olympic facilities. It creates an endowment for those Olympic facilities to make sure they're operational for the next 30 years and they're free to attend for families, for free skates, etc., to make sure that we're getting thousands of affordable housing units built, and to make sure that we have the platform of the games to tell our city's story, our province's story, and our nation's story. I think the return on investment for Calgary taxpayers is much better in a bid than if we were to take that money, which will be spent and will be charged to Calgary taxpayers anyways in the next budget cycle, regardless of whether we pursue this. I think that's the right way to approach it.
The other concern that people had was around the LRT and not going to the airport. And that's not included in this bid. From your perspective, what is the pro and con of that?
So the city transit plans, if you actually look at them, the consultations around the connection to the airport are still ongoing. I think they just had one of their first sessions over the summer where they had an open house and talking to folks about how they feel about it, what airport staff are actually using the bus rapid transit that actually goes to the airport, and how many folks would actually use an LRT connection versus driving. And I think it's an interesting proposal that the city is pursuing and weighing in consultation. But again, this is where folks don't learn from the mistakes of previous bids, which is if you tack on a number of infrastructure projects to a bid, like think of the ones you just mentioned, a new NHL stadium arena that would accommodate not only an NHL Flames team, but also all the concert staging that the best artists and musicians in the world today are using, and a massive public transit addition to the Green Line that has already been added as part of our initial capital plans and leverage provincial and federal dollars for. To add on a connection to the LRT as part of the bid would only introduce complexity, would only introduce the likelihood of cost overruns, would only introduce more public sector contributions and tax dollars going to that with a very short timeline before the bid to build all of these things at once. This is what happened in Sochi. This is what happened in a number of cities where they built too fast, too quick. Even in Vancouver, they added in some of these things after the fact. It upped the price tag a little bit later. I think that if the city wants to pursue a connection to the airport, because I guarantee you, I live downtown in just across from downtown in Kensington, I will use that. Best believe I will be using that to go to the airport. But if it means so much to you to do, if it's a public priority for the city, build it anyways. You don't need the excuse of an Olympic bid to build it. Why don't we focus on the things that are already stated goals that we actually need, that are existing on our capital priorities list that are not being built, which are the field house. Edmonton has 4, we have none. Focus on that. You said you want to build it, and let's do it. You want affordable housing to take care of our most vulnerable, to take care of those folks that want to get back into the economy but don't have a safe and secure place to live, for those struggling with opioid addictions, for those struggling with domestic violence concerns. If that is what you want to do in your city, which everyone I think thinks is a priority that needs funding, let's do it. That's the way to leverage public dollars. The sentiment around another transit project that is going to expand upon the Green Line, which isn't even built yet, I don't think is at the top of the list. It is a nice to have. It is not a must have. So if that matters and public support garners for it and they figure out a plan with the airport, I think that there's, again, room for them to build it. But as part of a bid book, let us stick to the most pragmatic, let us stick to the most base level needs of this Olympics. And I promise you, if you stay true to that goal, you will provide the most successful model or more sustainable model for an Olympics in the modern era. You will not be one of the ones that built and built and built and experienced cost overruns. You will have been fiscally conservative. You will be restrained. You will be more thoughtful in your planning design around a bid and around city building than any other city in the modern era. I think that's more of a goal that we should be pursuing. And if it matters to council later on to build out that connection, build it out.
Yeah, from the people that I've talked to in Vancouver, the Canada line, and you can probably correct me if I'm wrong. You probably know this as to be true or not. It wasn't part of the bid, but it became a benefit of the Olympics, of getting the Olympics, as they felt the necessity to get the Canada line. It sounds like you're kind of saying the same thing, is that there could be some benefits from this that could happen, but you're not necessarily going to put that in a bid.
Right, and I think about, when you're looking at Vancouver at the time and looking at Calgary at the time, we're different cities. We have different priorities. We're at different stages, I think, in our development as well. And we also have to think about our existing priorities that will come up in 2 years from now and 4 years from now. And what I'm saying is, if that comes up naturally, if there's a public need for it, if we're able to leverage new dollars, additional dollars from other orders of government so that we're not going alone on this, certainly be open to it. I think in Vancouver, they were able to garner some political support after the plebiscite, after they had won the bid to be able to get this done. I do think that applying to host as part of the candidature process and actually winning the games and being the identified host city are two different positions to be in. So when you're a host city, for example, for a number of these infrastructure projects, it would be interesting to see what private-public partnerships come about from it. It would be interesting to see what private investment comes as part of being an identified host. Because right now, with the instability of not knowing whether we're going to be the winning bid or not, and understanding that this process has come together quite quickly. And I want to commend the work that the Bid Corporation and Calgary 2026 did. They are 4.5 years ahead of every average bid corporation in their budgeting. They are using, tens of thousands of data points. They're commissioning economic analysis reports and independent reports. The city is doing the same thing. They're doing this all out in the open. They've released an 87, page document hosting plan as well to the public. This is some good work. And if these things come about as a winning bid city, I think it expands the conversation. And particularly, I think it gives Calgary more leverage as a host city, not only with the IOC, but with other investors as well, and with other orders of government, depending on what their priorities are. So we're in different scenarios. Is the potential there that it could happen? Sure. But at the end of the day, this is the plan that we have. It's, I think, the most pragmatic, fiscally responsible plan. And let's stick to it and see what happens if we're successful in hosting or being identified as the host for the 2026 Olympic and Paralympic Games.
Now, I want to talk about some perceptions right now, and one of them, of course, is when I say the term $5.2 billion, that is, like, if you get a bill that's expensive that you're looking at, you're like, holy crap, and you see $5.2 billion as an estimate, there is going to be a natural reaction, probably quite negative to it. So from your perspective, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, but maybe from the economic perspective, you explain why you think it's a bit more calm the public down a bit about the $5.2 billion, maybe.
Sure, and I think that Mary Moran, the CEO of the Bid Corporation, did this really, really well in council chambers on Tuesday, because a lot of I wouldn't say a lot, 1 to 2 of the councillors were trying to bait her into a statement of what the cost of the games would be. And the most appropriate response, she said, there are 2 costs or 2 budgets. operations and capital. And the person kept badgering, give me a number, and the number of 5.2 isn't the actual cost. So let me parse that out and break this down. And I think when you look at it from this perspective, it makes a lot more sense. So if you separate the fact that to operate the games, there's one expense associated with that. And then to build out the infrastructure, because that varies depending on where you go, to build out the infrastructure related to hosting the games is a separate expense. So let's talk about operations. Operations were pegged at $2.23 billion. That's to operate. That is your to host. That is actually in relation to hosting the games and all of the things related to making sure that games runs on time, on schedule, etc. All of the planning that goes along with that, all the people power that goes along with that. At $2.23 billion, that money gets offset by revenues in literally every single games. So even when you look at horribly managed games like Sochi, where the price tag was $50 billion, they still balanced on operations. So that whatever the cost was on operations for them, if it was $2 billion, they offset that cost by selling sponsorships. They offset that cost by ticket revenues, by international sponsorship, all of those things, advertising dollars, etc. All of those costs offset, and that number went away. In our context, it's even more likely to go away, and not even likely, it's assured to go away, because the IOC has already introduced $700 million in cash that wasn't offered to any of the previous host cities that have all balanced their budgets on operations. So for that $2.23 billion, that number literally goes to zero without any sort of contribution from taxpayers. The majority of that, 90% of that, is from private investment. So that's when your sponsorships, your advertisers who buy tickets, private sales of tickets to anyone who wants to attend as a privately generated cost, all of that money is basically offset by the revenues. And there's the potential as well in some cases where you have a little bit of a surplus. So all of a sudden, from the $5.23 billion price tag, $2.23 billion actually goes away. So when you look at the actual cost is $3 billion, but even that we can parse out. So that $3 billion is a public contribution related to infrastructure. Now, the government of Canada has said, and they wrote a very, very supportive letter that was read aloud in council, and then that was released in a media release the next day, which said, we absolutely support the Calgary 2026 bid for the Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games. And part of their rule at the federal government is to fund these kinds of events up to 50% of the total cost. And the assurances that Council has and that Calgary 2026 has is that depending on the contributions of the city and the provincial government, the federal government will contribute 50% of that. They will match that contribution. So all of a sudden that $3 billion cost all of a sudden goes to $1.5 billion. And the $1.5 billion, I would argue to folks, is not new tax dollars. So when we contribute our income taxes to Ottawa, I don't think it's this $1.5 billion is a new cost to taxpayers. What it actually is there are billions of dollars that sit in the federal government budget. They support events every single year. So when Canada 150 happens and all of these celebrations happen, there is a budget for that, no matter who's in government, whether it's the Conservative government, the NDP, or the federal, the Liberals right now. All of them have line item budgets for events. So when we host the G7, when we host the World Cup for FIFA in the upcoming years, all of these things have budgeted items for security, for hosting, for supporting cultural events. That money actually resides in a number of different arms of that government. So don't think of it as new tax dollars that are being contributed. It's actually just a redirection of funds that will already be spent anyways. So that $1.5 billion, I assure people, will be spent. The only difference that I'm advocating for is I want that money spent in Calgary. And for folks who think that Calgary is getting the short end of the stick on a number of fronts in relation to Ottawa, this is a way to get that money spent here. It's not new money. So all of a sudden now we're left with $1.5 billion in relation to the province and in relation to the city. I think what we've advocated for and what the bid corporation is suggesting is that Calgary taxpayers be on the hook for the $500 million and the province be on the hook for $1 billion. And when I look at the Calgary context of $500 million to local taxpayers, parse that out again, the field house will cost $300 million base. It could come in a little bit higher than that. That is going to be charged to taxpayers in the next budget cycle, whether we host the Olympics or not. $300 million. The upgrades to McMahon Stadium, the upgrades to some of our Olympic facilities that are running out of the endowment that was left from 1988, any sort of contributions to affordable housing, that will also be charged to Calgary taxpayers, probably in excess. I believe Council quoted up to $800 million will be charged to Calgary taxpayers if we don't pursue a bid. The bill stops at $500 million if we pursue a bid. So that remains is $1 billion for the province, which I think, given their investments intended investments in infrastructure related to affordable housing, which I think, whether it's the NDP, the Alberta Party, or the UCP, or the Liberals, whoever operates in power in 2019, they will have to make a substantive contribution to affordable housing. They will need to contribute some dollars to those Olympic facilities, as they've been doing thus far. All of a sudden, that cost gets broken down to a smaller number that we would have to spend far more to gain the kind of benefits that we're doing. So I think the sticker shock obviously appears that way when you put out a random number of $5.2 billion and you don't contextualize it. And I think it's kind of irresponsible that a lot of folks have led with that number, because that's not the actual cost. And my job is just the way I've done today, is to hopefully go out into the community and talk to folks about this, because it's a really creative, smart, fiscally responsible way about approaching a bid that I haven't seen another government, I haven't seen another host city pursue in past games. And that's what I think we need to make clear to Calgarians in approaching November 13th.
I'm curious, you talked about the federal government, what's about Rachel Notley, and potentially, you already kind of brought this up, and potentially we could have a new government in 2019. I mean, we don't know. Depends on the polls, whatever. But what about Jason Kenney and the UCP? What have you had conversations with them? What are their perceptions at this point in time?
Yeah, so I stay out of this. My main priority is talking into the community and talking to our organizations, talking to our business folks, talking to representatives from our most vulnerable community. So I haven't spoken to anyone from any party in relation to this. I haven't actually spoken to anyone on council about this. So my main perception, at least outwardly from what they've said in the media, I think from the NDP's perspective, they're playing this a little bit too safe. I think that they've said 30 days in advance of the plebiscite, they will announce their cost-sharing agreement or their contribution towards this bid. I think they made the plebiscite a condition of their support because I think they're tentative about which way to go, one or the other. So they wanted to have a little bit of a buffer to say, well, this is what Calgary's said, and we will respect the results of the plebiscite. Jason Kenney has also said the same thing. I don't think either of them want to weigh in one way or the other. And he has said that he would respect the results of the plebiscite. And I think we should hold them to account to that as we proceed into 2019, as we proceed post-November 14th, if we are successful. They need to adhere to the will of Calgarians on November 13th. And if the answer is no, the answer is no. And if the answer is yes, it should be yes. I genuinely think as well, a lot of people are framing this bid, particularly from the UCP side, in terms of a political argument that makes sense for them in 2019. So a lot of the argument that we're hearing for the past year and even before that is that Calgary's broke, the province is broke, federal government's broke, everything's bad, the world is on fire. So this is a two-week party that's very frivolous. And they're not actually engaging substantively with the information that's been released. And I think that does a huge disservice to folks even who are supporters in that party, to maybe even who are supporters of that candidate. I think they have to take the effort to engage substantively with this proposal, and also to not have a memory lapse about 1988. You can't say it's a two-week party when for the last 30 years you have lived and thrived and raised your children in a city that have benefited from the infrastructure and the community spirit that was garnered from the 1988 games. I think it's quite offensive to say that the Olympics are a 2-week party and that's it. It's not an investment in affordable housing or ignoring any of those kinds of contributions. So whether you're on either side of the political spectrum, I think that we need to demand that they engage with this a lot more substantively than they are right now.
Okay, and leads us to your public conversations. Of course, social media is one area, and for me, I have to admit, I'm seeing a lot of negative and concerns about this, but I'm only looking at this from a social media perspective. You are on the ground, you're talking to people. What are you hearing right now?
We'll also be clear, I'm in those tweets too. So I'll tell you a little bit about both. I'll start with what's on the ground. What I hear on the ground is completely different from what I see on social media. And let's be clear, what happens on social media, especially in a changing political climate around the world, as we talk about cyberbullying, as we talk about abusive behavior, as we talk about misinformation leading up to elections, social media has not done democratic processes a great deal of good, I would say, over the last 5 to 8 years. But on the ground, what I'm seeing is a really, really thoughtful engagement with the information. I think they want more information. I want more information. I'm a data guy. I love this stuff. But what I'm seeing are basically 3 things. The first is that a lot of folks who have children are looking at this bid through their children's eyes and potentially their grandchildren's eyes, and seeing that, in keeping a lot of these facilities open for the next 30 years. And also, I want to make a point that I neglected to make earlier. These Olympic facilities, the Oval, Windsport, all of them, over the last 30 years, because of the endowment that was left, Calgary taxpayers don't actually contribute to the operations of those facilities. It's actually our stake in that whole, for over 30 years, our stake has been 5% of our tax, of the contribution to operations come from Calgary taxpayers. 5% over 30 years. Yet we are the unbelievably lucky people that get to benefit from all these facilities. So we use them, we take our children there, we train there if we're an athlete, yet we don't actually pay for them. So to ensure, and to dovetail back to what I'm hearing on the ground, is that folks say this has added a number of positives in relation to wellness and in relation to our economy. We host 9 World Cups. We're hosting 9 World Cups this winter. We've hosted hundreds of events since 1988 at a world championship level. Those inject hundreds of millions of dollars into our economy each year. Tourism revenues goes up, hotel occupancies go up. So all of them are recognizing the importance of keeping those facilities as well for their children. The second thing I'm hearing on the ground is an absolute rejection of the cynicism, I think, that is garnering some steam on the no side around the city's ability to get things done. For the small amount of folks that were here in '88, but for those who have thrived in business, in sport, in community work, I don't think the message that we're a downtrodden city, or that we could not pull this off, or that we're a small city, a complete rejection of the fact that we are receiving these world accolades from major bodies in terms of livability and health and wellness. They're absolutely rejecting that message. Are they susceptible and vulnerable to it if enough negativity and ugliness gets out there? I think everyone is, but I don't think that that's holding water right now. And the third thing on the ground that I've noticed is a number of people who have not been engaged in political processes before, finding this as an interesting way to get involved for the first time, to be able to contribute to something that's bigger than themselves. When I went back to my first point that I made when I first started the conversation with you, was around the idea that we've already done this. And I said, who's we? This is an incredibly amazing thing. And the fact that we live in Calgary and we folks hosted in 1988 makes it seem normal or average, or this kind of everydayness or laissez-faire approach to this. This is actually incredible that we have folks on the ground that are making small local changes that will actually change the course of the world. that we will, just based on selling pins and going door knocking and talking at dog parks and in our hockey leagues and things like that, will actually maybe change the course of the world or change the course of this city or country or province for 30 years or 40 years. That thousands of kids will be able to play in recreation facilities because of the efforts you made on the ground. So putting a battery in people's back to say, everyone's going to tell you this is normal. This is not. This is crazy. This is an incredible opportunity, and you should be as fired up and charged up about doing this and getting involved in your community as ever. And if you've never put on a political party jersey before, this is an amazing way to get involved in your community without doing that. Now, in relation to what's happening on social, I'm a little bit disheartened by the misinformation that's going out. I'm really troubled on the no side, the kinds of astroturf groups that they've aligned themselves with, that are purposely spreading information, whose only sole job online is to erode the public's confidence in the ability of their city council, in their ability of the city of Calgary administration, who work incredibly hard every single day to get great things done for our city. I think that's a huge concern. I'm actually really concerned as well by the kind of personal attacks and just ugly kind of talk, because I invite people to look at this. I invite people to look online and find a yes advocate, whether they're associated with Yes Calgary 2026 or not, or just folks who believe in the upsides to this bid, if they're engaging in that type of behavior. And when folks are fact-checked and it's pointed out that something that they've said is not true, it already has maybe 50 retweets before they concede that's, oh yeah, I read that wrong. But what damage was done by the initial tweet that somehow got into people's ears? So getting out into the community at the grassroots level is, I think, the strength of our effort, and to contribute to the dialogue healthily on Twitter and on Facebook and Instagram, etc., but to not get bogged down in the unrelenting negativity, because it can absolutely be a dumpster fire of conversation that goes on there. And I would invite people to not let themselves be exposed to that on a visceral level, and to look after their own wellness when participating.
Two more quick questions, but we'll get into the education part. But I do want to ask about the concept on your website called the distant plan. Correct me if I'm wrong. I want to be clear. The talk about the curling facilities is supposed to be going to Edmonton. Is that clear?
So again, I'll just interject once again. So the Bid Corporation's website is the one you're talking about, not our website.
Okay. Let's. Yeah. So that we'll get to that too. But is it my understanding that the curling would be going to Edmonton?
No. So what Calgary 2026, the Bid Corporation, said in council chambers on Tuesday is that ongoing negotiations exist. They have a number of solutions for curling. So if you notice the plan, if you notice the fact that it was starred as to does not have a location yet, it's because there are, I think, 3 to 4 solutions that they're discussing currently right now that could be able to accommodate that. So I don't know if Edmonton is in, I don't know if Edmonton is out, or a number of other discussions are being bandied about. So I don't want to speculate, but I just know that there are 3 to 4 solutions that they're possibly weighing as to where to host curling.
Okay. Because I wasn't sure about, I read Edmonton, and I also have read something else. I did want to clarify that. But there is talk about this concept of distant plan, and you talked about the benefits for Calgary, and there is concern about having an event in Whistler, and then possibly, we don't know, but another event in another city. What are your thoughts on, or what are you hearing about that concept of the distant plan? What is called on a website, distant plan. What are your thoughts on that? Is that something we should be concerned about? I
think that we have to go back to what we originally started our conversation about, which was about being pragmatic and being thoughtful and looking at what's in the best interests of Calgary. We're talking about one event, ski jumping, that would be held in Whistler. And in relation to that, we have to look at our current stock taking of our facilities. So our ski jumps do not meet the regulation height of the new Olympic standards. They're old, they're falling apart, which shows you that some of these facilities, while operational, do need some major love in terms of an upgrade. And I think they had the choice as to whether to, is it a worthy investment of, because again, this is the infrastructure part of this is the citizen contribution, the public contribution. Is it responsible enough to Calgary and Alberta and federal taxpayers to use the funds to build out new regulation ski jumps and have to manicure the area to make sure that there's enough room, because as of right now, you'd be, I think, jumping onto the highway. Is that worth our time to consider, or is there a much more pragmatic, thoughtful approach for one event that doesn't necessarily have consequences for a lot of our big ticket items all the way through? And also then, what is the lasting benefit to Calgary citizens who would enjoy that venue? So that's a very small used part of the facilities. It's a very not often used instrument for those who engage in that practice. And is it something that we could live without? And I think that that's a smart thing to do. And it shows you that this is not about doing something that is going to appeal to every single base instinct of voters for November 13th. It's about doing what's smart and what's in the best interest of the city. And if we're respecting taxpayer contributions, does that solve a problem by having this one event in Whistler? And I think it does on its face. I think that's a compelling reason to not feel as though we have to do everything. We have to take things on that are beyond our purview and don't necessarily have a lasting benefit for the next 30 years. If it doesn't, do we have a novel solution to remedy that concern? And in this case, they came up with one. And I think that that's the right call to make.
Yeah. So in terms of now future public consultations, we're at the point that we're going to have the plebiscite on November 13th. Where can people go to you? Tell us about the information on some of the stuff that you'll be talking about and where you will be for the next couple of months.
Sure. So you can find our website at yescalgary2026.ca, on social at yescalgary2026. What we've actually been doing for the past week is something that I think we'll continue to do. So as a graduate student myself, I'm doing my PhD at the University of Calgary. 29 years old. I represent a little bit of a younger demographic in talking about our community efforts and leading up to 2026. I feel a profound responsibility to get folks my age and younger involved in this process because it disproportionately affects them. And I don't want them to give into apathy. In this election, in this plebiscite or in other elections, I think we need to get them more involved at all levels of governance so that the decisions that are made, the governance bodies that are elected are best reflective of their values and their concerns. So we just did a university tour that I co-organized with Brooklyn McDougall, an undergraduate U of C student who's on Next Gen Team Canada's speed skating team. And we did one at SAIT. We held a booth at their campus expo. We did one at the U of C Dinos tailgate last Friday. And we were at MRU the same day that we were at Council. So we're going to be having that presence, I think, on post-secondary campuses, at least from my end, because I want to make sure that we're engaging folks all the way along because they're not often engaged, I think, in this discussion. We're also going to be having a number of events. We did a number of rallies over the weekend in the community. We had one at the Genesis Center in the Northeast. We had one at Cardell in the South. And we had one at WinSports, Canadian Sports Hall of Fame. And it's just about getting people information, about engaging them in a positive vision for the city as it dovetails with the Olympic bid. I'm sure you deal with this on your podcast. There's a lot of negativity in the news today, a lot of sniping back and forth, a lot of tribalism. I think this has the opportunity, at least we're committed to this effort, of forwarding a really thoughtful, positive dialogue. I've said from the very beginning as we started this process that I could get to know. I'm open enough to emergent changes and trying to get the best deal for Calgarians that I could get to know. And unless these principles are adhered to, that could happen. So far, my expectations have been exceeded about how this bid has been handled. And what I think we're going to engage folks in conversations with, and what I want to leave them with is, when talking about the no sides argument, think about this. The no side has said from the very beginning, the IOC is corrupt. We want nothing to do with them. They've said very clearly that the economic results of this are hugely horrific for cities and for host cities and countries around the world. There is no economic benefit. It will not result in jobs. This is not in our best interest as a city. We should spend these unknown billions of dollars that are not coming to us, by the way, otherwise through a bid, on something else. They've created all of this negative argument as to why no one on earth should host an Olympic Games. Yet pay attention to what they've said in the last month. Well, why not 2030? Well, why would you in 2030 advocate in 4 years from now trying to win a bid for 2030 if all of the other things that you said are true? I think that folks like you and other folks in the media need to hold people to account on that line. If you think this is so negative, if you think this is so horrible, if you think that we're going to experience unrelenting cost overruns, why would you ever put out the idea that you want to host in 2030? That shows me a lack of consistency. It shows me that they're not interested in engaging in a thoughtful debate about what the best deal for Calgary is. They really just want to do this to get some notoriety for the fact that they took down a bid. And I think that does a disservice to Calgarians. I think the groups that they've aligned themselves with also do a disservice to Calgarians. It shows you that they're going to do as much as they can for short-term political gain, and damn be the consequences later on. That is not what we're committed to. So if you come to a Yes Calgary 2026 event, expect positivity, expect a vision related to community building, and respect an environment in which you can feel welcomed, in which you can feel, if you're a skeptic, you'll feel welcomed as well. If you're on the no side, you'll be engaged thoughtfully. You won't be shamed in any way. That is something that I think is more healthy for our dialogue, because no matter what happens on November 13th, on November 14th, we need to come together as a city and continue to have the conversations that relate to building out an even better city than we have right now. And I'm worried about some of the activities on that side are undermining that process and really just driving us further apart. There's some really reasonable folks on the no side, but from the official no camp, I expect a higher level of discourse and a better approach to this process going forward.
That's fair. Are you going to be, excuse me, are you going to be having any debates? Are you inviting someone, not necessarily from, are you going to have any debates, or is this more of like information sessions on your side? Or will there be a debate?
Both. I don't think it's in our purview to be organizing debates like that. I think that I'm really focused on, getting some donations through our pin collection. You can get a limited edition Yes Calgary 2026 pin on our website for $20.26, which help go to our fundraising costs in relation to shirts and buttons. It's a really storied tradition related to the Olympics. I think our efforts are best spent doing that kind of, empowering 1 to 2 volunteers with a shirt and a banner and some pins and going out than hosting major events. But that being said, some councillors I know have invited representatives from both camps to have these debates and have these discussions. Anyone who invites me into a room, I'll go discuss this. I think that we can elevate the discourse if we do so, rather than shouting each other down on Twitter, and it's mostly us getting shouted at. But yeah, I will be participating. I've already signed on for some debates or some information sessions that are being hosted by other partners, and we'll continue to do so right up until November 13th.
Well, from my perspective, I will be talking to Trevor Toome tonight. We'll talk more of an economic perspective, because that's Trevor Toome's wheelhouse, so we'll talk to him about that. And I am open into a debate. Stephen Carter said that he was open to a debate, and there's a possibility of that. So I'm open to hosting a debate on this podcast as well. So if you want that, I think we do have someone, not officially from the no side, but does have some concerns that wanted to get in. But I can't quickly announce that yet. Jason, thanks for coming on. And
thank you for having me. And I would invite you specifically to have someone from the identified no side, because if they're the ones that want to carry this movement forward, they shouldn't rely on I think the unofficial tepid support from other places to do their bidding. If they're that committed to a community conversation, if they feel as though they have the better argument, if you have someone officially from the no side sign up, I am happy to join you both for a conversation going forward. And in terms of Trevor Tombe, I think you'll have a great conversation with him tonight. I do think that, the job of academics and myself as a PhD student and managing my community responsibilities is to often poke holes in things. I think he's a great voice in addition to the discourse in Calgary and in Alberta. I do wonder sometimes about the economic analysis impacts versus the actual pragmatic financial implications of making a decision like this and the benefits, because certain economists and certain models won't attribute specific benefits depending on where they are in the spectrum in the academic world to particular interventions like infrastructure that wouldn't be afforded or dollars that wouldn't have been leveraged through a bid. They don't predict in that way. So I think it should be taken with a grain of salt, but I'm happy that you're talking to him, and I'm happy that he's contributing to this discussion.
Awesome. Great. And of course, you can follow me, Facebook, Kevin Olenek, Spreaker.com, KVULE, SoundCloud.com, KVULE, YouTube, Kevin Olenek. Subscribe on the podcast, on iTunes, Agree or Disagree the podcast. We will talk to you all soon. Bye for now.